Morning, everybody. Happy spring equinox day, and welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined for the first time by the Mirror's defence editor, Chris Hughes. Good morning, Chris.
Morning, Susie. Morning, everyone. How are you?
It's his first time on the show, everyone, so be gentle with him. He's only been to Iraq and stuff like that. He's a bit sensitive. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. Those of you listening later on podcast are just going to have to compile a dodgy dossier of what you imagine might have happened instead. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on calls for Gloria's Law, which is a bid to make it a legal requirement for a nominated care supporter to enter care homes to be with the dying after so many were denied the comfort of a loved one during the pandemic. There's more on that inside. But first, because we've got Chris here, I want to discuss the visit of everyone's favourite despot, Vladimir Putin, to Mariupol, the city he slaughtered almost in a missile bombardment last year, including targeting hospitals and air raid shelters. Now, he snuck in under cover of darkness, Chris, at the end of last week, met some hand-picked locals who were in tears, apparently. I think we all would be. And it's a long way from Joe Biden's stride around Kyiv, isn't it? It doesn't look particularly impressive. Why did he do it?
It doesn't look impressive, does it, Susie? But also, just witness how uncomfortable he looked. He arrived there in darkness, clearly so that you couldn't see the background, which probably looks like Dresden, I would have thought. They selected some very pristine buildings. They must have been some of the few that were there. The BBC have done a kind of geolocated his route, and he will have driven just yards to his right at one stage during his brief drive. He was just maybe a few hundred yards from the theatre, which his Air Force blew up, which had clear signs that women and children were sheltering in it, and dozens died there. This is the scene of one of the many atrocities being committed by his troops in Ukraine. Mariupol is pretty much a dysfunctional city with and the few locals that turned out will have been hand selected. I think, just going back to your question, I think he did it in the aftermath of the arrest warrant that's been served on him by the ICC. It's probably deemed to be good for optics back home, which is all he cares about. All Putin cares about, but by all accounts, is how he's perceived at home. And I mean, clearly, because he's not doing too much for his public image abroad, is he?
No, exactly. It's all about something that plays back domestic, like you say, because that's also, if there's any threat to him and his position, I suppose that's where it's going to come. Now, Eileen says, good morning. Putin's an evil man. He's a war criminal. There's so much blood in his hand and no regard for human life. Some of that stuff, how uncomfortable he looked, Chris, in the footage we saw, it's like he's in this tiny apartment that the Russians have rebuilt. It was like, it's been a long time since Putin was in an apartment this humble, because normally everything he's got is just covered in gold, isn't it? But
it's a long way from his upbringing in St. Petersburg. But I mean, it just look at how sort of sociopathic he looks when he's meeting locals. He can't smile. There's no warmth there. He doesn't even pretend. And he's desperate to get away. I think at one stage the translator said that he said something like, thank you, sorry for bothering you, we'll get out of your hands. It was a bit like visiting people that you really detest. And it really comes over, doesn't it? It's and when he's driving in the car, he could barely see over the wheel. You hear this horrible, really awkward conversation between him and I think it's his deputy prime minister. I'm not sure what they were saying, but and these streets were darkened. You couldn't really see what was going on. He doesn't want Russians to see just exactly what has been done in their name to Mariupol. It was horrible.
Yeah, it's not very nice at all. But now today, President Xi Jinping of China is visiting Moscow on the first leg of what we assume might be some kind of a peace talk, because it's going to be followed by a trip to Kyiv to see President Zelensky. And there's a lot of concern, Chris, that China's somehow going to arm Russia and sort of prolong this war as well. So why is Xi going there? What's he hoping to achieve? Is there any chance that it might lead to peace?
I think publicly he probably wants to be seen as some sort of peace broker. There's a big opportunity for someone there. I mean, most Western leaders have tried to get involved. We saw Macron trying to plead for peace in that incredibly awkward meeting between him and Putin. So Xi is probably, I would have thought, trying to position himself as a sort of, a peace broker. I think privately there have been rumors, reports. We've done a few stories on this, that China is already talking to Putin about either already having supplied drone technology, or possibly supplying drone technology in the future. This is swarm drones, which will be devastating to Ukraine. It is worrying that on the Security Council, China hasn't openly approved the full-on invasion of. We say full-on invasion because, of course, they entered Ukraine in 2014. He hasn't openly approved it, but just by being there, it looks like a bit of a sort of not a green light, but it does look like a kind of a nod, an approval. You're doing okay, mate, sort of thing.
Yeah,
it's not good for us. Yeah.
No, and especially after, Putin's had this arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court. It's also, it's kind of an endorsement. Like, I don't mind too much about this from President Xi. Perhaps they can sit down and discuss their mutual crimes against humanity. That'd be a lovely lunch, wouldn't it? Now, Maria said, God help all those in war zones. I cannot imagine what all those people are going through. Just why? But of course, after this arrest warrant, Chris, that Putin's had, he's probably never going to actually face a court over that. Putin's enemies generally find themselves on the wrong end of a window, don't they? Is he anywhere near being deposed? I mean, this kind of stunt he's done in Mariupol, is that going to make a difference back home?
Well, it's interesting. Most of the people I speak to, and things happen very, very quickly in Russia. So if something was going to happen to him and people in the Kremlin, it would happen very quickly. It would be pretty bloody, I would imagine. I personally don't think anything will happen to him anytime soon. I think that the problem is, if anyone hopes that by Putin being deposed, someone more pleasant might take over, I think that's a very slim possibility. There isn't anyone waiting in the wings who would be a sort of wholesome, better choice. There are some quite extreme people in the Kremlin who might even step it up a bit. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think he is in a very, very difficult position. He's becoming increasingly more and more paranoid and isolated. And the problem with that is that he may not even know fully what the picture is on the front line in Ukraine. There have been reports that the lead time for him to be told, given updates on places like Bakhmut, which for some reason has become not strategically, but very, a very important target for Russian troops. It's quite possible that he's not aware, as he is not as aware as he should be of what's happening.
No, maybe he even drove into Mariupol under darkness because they didn't want him to see.
Yes, almost certainly. Yeah.
All things are possible, aren't they? Now, get into the comments, everybody. Tell us what you think about Putin's prospects and these talks with President Xi today. Is that going to help at all, or is it going to make things worse? Let us know what you think. But next, I want to go to what's probably the most important story of the day, although it's some places only going to get a flick of a mention because it's an anniversary, but it's one that really puts the minor sort of political squabbles and the refugee crisis of the day into quite a bit of perspective. So 20 years ago today, Britain and America went into Iraq alone, isolated from the rest of the world community, on this assertion, which we all now know is bogus, that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and he needed to be removed from power. Now, he was part of this sort of axis of evil that was blamed for all the world's ills in the wake of 9/11. And the Mirror, very famously, was against that war, and most of the British people as well were against it. There were huge marches around London for that. Now, Chris, you went to New York very soon after the towers came down. when and what, according to the brilliant book I reread last night, Chris Hughes, Road Trip to Hell, buy a copy if you can still find it in print anywhere, anybody. You were in New York soon after the towers came down. So why did Iraq start getting discussed as a target or the blame for this? Because I can't remember any Iraq connection to 9/11 whatsoever.
No, and there wasn't one. What happened was, in the background, the neocons had been desperate to depose Saddam, replace him with someone else for some time. This was mainly driven by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld primarily wanted to do this. He was conspiring to have intelligence leaked to him from the CIA so that he could kind of undermine them. Look at the way Trump treated the CIA and the FBI when he was in power. This was grossly misleading to the American people and the people, and in the West and NATO countries. Intelligence experts were kind of coerced. They were, we had the dodgy dossier which claimed that, which was manipulated to claim that Saddam was not far off being able to launch WMDs at the West. It was absolute nonsense. I mean, I went to Iraq a few times before the war. So yeah, I was in New York after the Twin Towers came down and all of the other associated attacks. And I remember Tony Blair visited there was a church near the Ground Zero. And as he came out, he gave that famous speech and said that one country stood with us during the Second World War and the First World War. And we were all looking at each other thinking, where's this going? And then as soon as he finished, he sort of gave a knowing smile and walked off. And everybody started ringing their news desks because it was clear that he gave a very strong hint that Iraq was next. So for the next, it was over a year, I think, reporters were going to Baghdad, talking to Iraqis about the possibility that there would be an attack or an invasion of Iraq to depose Saddam. Everybody was, all these politicians were scrabbling around trying to prove that Al-Qaeda somehow had a footprint in Iraq. In fact, Saddam had probably done more. I mean, I don't want to say anything nice about the guy because he was a nasty piece of work, but he'd done a hell of a lot to get rid of, to ensure that Al-Qaeda wasn't in Iraq. Shortly after the invasion, you had this monstrous former Jordanian drug dealer, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He became a sort of, poster child for beheaders in Iraq. He met bin Laden in Afghanistan. The story gets slightly complicated with him because he really was a psychopath, but he became so unpleasant, and they killed so many. So his branch of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, became so unpleasant. They were disenfranchised by Iraq and by Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, they were too rough for Al-Qaeda to put up with.
Exactly, and so ISIS was born. And
yeah, well, we'll move on to that in a little bit. We've got ahead of ourselves slightly, but what do you remember about the invasion, everybody, about Iraq when all this happened? Where were you on the Mirror's stance of there should be no war? And were you on the marches? Did you think it was a good idea at the time? Have you since sort of had the scales lifted from your eyes? Let us know. Maxine says, if it hadn't been for Blair and Bush, I'd still have my uncle here. A Turkish Kurd killed him because of the Iraq war. I'm so sorry, Maxine. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm so sorry that's happened to your uncle. Now, of course, after Chris, during the initial invasion, you were at CENTCOM, Central Command, the US base in Qatar, where they were trying to keep the press away from the invasion as much as possible, which you write about quite a lot in your book. And in fact, they weren't answering very many questions. It was all just just like a PR sham more than anything else. But some of the Iraqis, when the Allies first went in, were quite welcoming. They welcomed the Allies. They wanted to be rid of Saddam, didn't they, as well?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, and when you can see all the sort of pro-Western posters that during that film of when you see that Saddam's statue being dragged down, and I mean, I think within weeks, when the water stopped flowing, when the power was off constantly, when food wasn't on the table, people started panicking and started asking questions and saying, hang on, where's all this democracy you were promising us? The problem was the infrastructure of Iraq. No thought had been given to what do we do about security? Well, so Paul Bremer, the coalition provisional authority head, this former US diplomat, sorry, he just got rid of the Ba'ath Party, which is all powerful. He got rid of all the police. He got rid of all the soldiers, and all these people went into the shadows and started, setting up groups secretly, and that was the beginning of the insurgency. You could see it was happening. American forces in Baghdad, they did their best to hold back rioting and that sort of thing, and the rioting started turning into shooting and then bombings and then kidnappings, and it became quite anarchic by, I would think, well, within months.
That's it. I mean, the police and the Ba'ath Party, they were the discipline under Saddam. They were guilty of lots of horrific things themselves. So it's a good idea to clean them out, perhaps, but they needed to have something there to replace it, because
it's a good idea, sure.
Formed. And of course, without arresting those people or jailing them or putting them on trial, then they're just, like you say, they just slipped into the shadows, didn't they? So
there were thousands of them, Susie. There were tens of thousands of them almost overnight. We're told, you've been all powerful for so many years. You've had these positions of great privilege. Now that's all been taken from you. And they were extremely powerful. The tribes up in Tikrit, where Saddam was born and brought up, you could see on their faces that they were absolutely horrified by this. Their entire futures had been taken. And let's be pragmatic here. Even though they had done some horrendous things, they might not have chosen to do so had Saddam not been in power. And you do have to have a security apparatus soon after an invasion, because certainly the Americans and British were quite busy. They couldn't do it all. There was no rule of law in Iraq for years. And that meant that everything that people wanted to do understood. And don't forget also, because it was like sort of holding back a dam. You give people freedom, all of a sudden, it just, the floodgates were open, and it just became anarchy. And nobody was there to tell them not to do it.
No. So George Bush declared victory by May, which I remember that seemed shockingly quick at the time. They sent in this governor who sort of dismantled the whole force. And you've told us kind of what you saw there, but there was a democratic vote, and I can recall as well that being greeted by the Allies as, well, job done. Then they've got democracy now. They voted once. Everything will be fine.
That was very moving, actually. That was in, I think, 2005. And I was with some British soldiers somewhere in the south, I think it was, near Mujr al-Kabir, I think it was. And they were expecting an awful lot of the oppressed Shia Muslims from the south to sort of come over the horizon and vote. And they did. And some of them had spent days walking to to the poll stations. And, they were in their thousands. So that was the beginning of, there were seeds of hope then, but for everyone. So when they arrived, I think within days there were posters saying next time. So when you voted as a Shia Muslim from the south, you had indelible ink put on your finger to prove that you so that you couldn't vote twice, and a lot of the insurgency then started putting up posters saying, put ink on your finger and you will be killed. So nothing was done about that. What could you do? Who knows? But I'm not an expert in insurgency. And so that was the first time. I think that was in 2005. And so people were voting for the first time. And these were the Shia Muslim communities that were so horribly oppressed by Saddam, given a chance at democracy. And of course, as the majority in Iraq, eventually their leaders took power, and then all the Sunnis in places like Ramadi and Fallujah started complaining that there were death squads going in at night and executing the Sunni Muslim tribes and their leaders. Some of this was true. So the violence very, very quickly took hold.
Yeah. And of course, there was a massacre at Fallujah. 18 students were shot. There were protests the next day, and you were on the street there.
Yeah.
What happened?
Well, what happened was Fallujah was a particularly difficult city. It was known as the city of mosques. It had 2,000 mosques. It was just outside. It was about an hour's drive outside Baghdad, and we we heard there were reports that a school had been taken over by US troops, and some students had gone to demonstrate outside it the previous night, and the troops had opened fire. So we went along the next day to see what had, to try and investigate what had happened. And the school had been abandoned by these soldiers who'd gone round the corner to a much bigger base where they could park their tanks and that sort of thing. Pretty soon, another crowd of demonstrators gathered, and we were interviewing parents of the kids who'd been killed the night before. And we joined the demonstration. As we got round the corner, this is about 1,000 students, I think, probably in their teens. And by the way, the school had, as I recall, lots of insults daubed all over the walls about the Quran and the Prophet that had been left by US forces. And as we got around the corner, a patrol of Humvees was driving past, and so these kids started throwing their shoes at the Humvees. The Mirror photographer at the time, Julian Andrews, did some of their most outstanding war photography I've ever seen. It was just breathtaking. He took pictures of this guy opening fires with a 50 caliber machine gun from the back of the Humvee. So 2 more kids were basically just shot dead for throwing their shoes. And this was in April, and so Fallujah after that became a very, very, hotbed of hatred towards the West, and there were several wars there, and eventually it was brought to its knees, basically leveled by coalition troops.
And 20 years on, then what's in Fallujah now? What's it like now?
Well, I went there. I've been there twice since. I haven't been there for over a decade now. But I honestly don't know. I mean, the devastation that I saw there back then would mean it would have taken years to rebuild. I don't know whether. I mean, people will have left. It became for years and years. It became Al Qaeda, then an ISIS hotbed. And so there's not an awful lot there now. I mean, people have moved back, but like much of Baghdad, they're just struggling to make ends meet on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there's ordinary Iraqis who are still suffering an awful lot as a result of this war.
Don't forget, a lot of people fled over to the border into Syria, which then in the early 2000s was a much safer place. And then see what happened to them when they got to Syria. A lot of them had to go back then, or back into Iraq.
Yeah, and of course, and then that feeds so much other unrest in the region, refugee crisis, other problems. Yeah. And I can't believe that US, well, it's the kind of thing I hope anyway, that British troops wouldn't do, but US troops daubing graffiti and insults about the Quran on the walls of a building in a Muslim country they've occupied.
Yeah.
What bit of their brains thought that was even if you genuinely think you ought to somehow, it's not professional, but it's just going to make yourself a target. You're just going to be in more danger.
I found it shocking, and there's no way it was placed there by anyone else but them, because they'd only left hours before. And especially in the light of the fact that, I mean, I wasn't there the previous night, so I don't know if any shots had been fired at them. But yeah, I mean, it was very pointed. It was obviously going to be seen by teachers who returned to the school. I think the school was these kids went back to the school, so this would have been painted over. But I mean, we took pictures of it at the time, and everyone was quite shocked that anyone would be that dense, that they thought that what were they going to gain? They were at the beginning of what anyone by any metric you would have known. This was the beginning of an insurgency. Not only that, but a very, very, very violent, bloody, nasty one. What was to be gained? I mean, I just don't understand it. Didn't understand it at the time, but yeah.
No, well, Americans. John says, Julian Assange showed us the true crimes of the American troops. He did. I would suggest that's probably not the thing that he did wrong. I think he did some other stuff wrong, Julian, but he did actually show some of this stuff that was happening and was sort of not being publicized too much by the Americans. But you know, it's been 20 years now, Chris. We know about the dossier not being correct. We know about what happened at Fallujah. We know about Abu Ghraib and the torture that was captured there. We know about Zarqawi, as you've said, and the rise of ISIS and everything else. As Anne-Marie says, you know, this illegal war brought nothing but injury, death, and destructions. Thousands upon thousands displaced, according to the refugee crisis. It brought terrorism to our shores, and Britain and America just walked away and deserted these people away from the devastation they helped cause. Maxine, who said earlier on, lost her uncle. A Turkish Kurd resented what had happened in the war. And created generations of people who, unlike those perhaps in Kosovo who named their children Tony Blair in gratitude, in Iraq, it's very much the other way around. What's the legacy of all that? I mean, we know what the legacy is, but I mean, was it ever justified? Would any of that stuff happened if we hadn't invaded Iraq? Would we have had ISIS? It might have happened anyway, mightn't it?
It's possible. I personally don't think so. I think that a lot of the ills, a lot of the terror-related incidents now that happen now and will happen in the future, almost certainly, were seeded in the Iraq invasion. I think the mismanagement of the aftermath of the invasion, which, by the way, was pretty much a success in the first few weeks. The aftermath, the way the security apparatus was collapsed, all of that, the mismanagement, I think it was directly responsible for the eventual growing of Al Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS. ISIS is still there. ISIS are still in Syria next door, albeit in small pockets. But entire towns like Mosul in northern Iraq have been, large parts of the old town in Mosul has been leveled, they literally leveled as the last pockets of ISIS were wiped out. And you've got to ask, was it all worth it? By and large, there is some stability in Iraq now. Islamic State have had their moment, and they don't hold any ground as such now. But this is something that needs to be watched. It's hard to know what will happen in the future. The legacy will be maybe Iraq will not be the cauldron of it's not a well-run country, and you wonder where it's going to go. I think that the economy, people are still very poor there. The legacy isn't that positive, except that the violence has eventually been reduced.
Yeah. Now, Josie says the government hadn't done their homework. All they wanted was to change the leader of the country, who they had just a few years ago called a friend and provided with arms and money. Exactly. And personally, Josie, when I saw some of that footage at the time, I remember thinking that this was just boys wanted to play with their toys. They had some lovely bunker busters, and they had some very nice sexy footage they wanted to show of bombs raining down on precision down a chimney kind of thing, and they wanted to show the world what they could do against some guy who had some very old tanks, basically. But the time is probably going to prove some of us right about some of these things. But there's one more thing I want to discuss before we move on to anything else. We can't let Chris go without mentioning his brilliant tabloid scoop, which was to be the first reporter to set foot in Saddam's hidey hole when he was eventually discovered in a small clearing outside his hometown of Tikrit. But sadly, it was just your foot, wasn't it, Chris? Can you tell us very quickly how you got that story and what happened when you found the hole?
Well, it was Christmas, months after the invasion. I was sent there. The story was Saddam Hussein had been arrested near his hometown of Tikrit by the American troops, the CIA, Special Forces. We got there. I think it took about 2 or 3 days. We had several attempts at getting there, driving there from Baghdad in a convoy, along with a couple of other newspaper reporters from the UK. And then when we got there, it was funny because I was just about. It took ages to find the place, and it was surrounded by armed troops, obviously. And when we got there, this American general sort of said, "And there you go, there's Saddam's hole." And the guy from the I did just get my foot in there, and the guy from the Sun just pushed me out of the way and jumped in himself. So we're good friends, and we had a laugh about it. But we both claimed that we were the first in. In fact, I'll admit now he was the first into the hole. It hardly mattered because it was a newspaper, and we weren't doing it in real time. But it was a pokey little thing as well. I can't imagine. You remember the picture of this sort of very raggedy-haired Saddam being dragged out of the hole by a US soldier? When you saw that, I remember thinking, Christ, that looks awful, and he'd been, they had swarmed the place the previous night as well, looking for him, and hadn't found him. And when they went back, they said, apparently, I mean, who knows if it's true, but they said to the tipster, we went there and he wasn't there. And he said, you're looking in the wrong place. He's underground. So it took them ages to find him. So it must have been terrifying for him. Yeah.
Yeah, and you're right in your book. I mean, obviously, Saddam was 6'4". You're over 6 foot and barely had any room in the hull, and it stank.
Yeah,
because he's been in there so long, just literally sweating, waiting for them to come and find him. Horrific, and great writing as well. So anybody, if you can find it on Amazon, get Chris's book. Everyone, it's very enlightening, especially in what's happened in the sort of the 20 years. It explains it all for you. Now, if you've got any more questions for Chris about his time covering Iraq, let us know. Get into the comments, and we'll try and wrap up at the end. But first off, we have managed to find some good news in the world for you, and here it is. Now, this is a sign of what can happen if you release people from a war. Not the picture of Susanna and Kevin from Strictly. To the other side of that, a little lad called Myron Levadne. He lived in Kharkiv in Ukraine and was a very keen ice hockey star. He was even in the Olympic reserve team, even though he's only 10 now. Now, the Russians bombed his ice rink because that's the kind of things the Russians have done. He fled with his mum, and he was taken in by a British family under the resettlement scheme. And he now plays with the Swindon Wildcats, who are raising money for his kit and equipment. So he's back on the ice. He's doing what he loves, hopefully becoming a sports star of the future. I suppose, Chris, this is proof, isn't it? Not only that it's worth taking in refugees who may flee their home without all their necessary paperwork, of course, but, the benefit of planning for their future and helping them realize their potential, whether it's here or in their home country, rather than just letting them rot as we did in Iraq.
Absolutely. And, I can tell you this, having spent months in Ukraine this year and last year, sport is incredibly important to Ukrainians. I mean, I'm quite keen cyclist, and I met a Ukrainian cyclist just going out in the Surrey Hills one day, and I said, why is it that Ukrainians are so keen on sport? Every single person, man, woman, and child, they're all, they're in the gym and they're swimming, or when they're not, they're having to deal with the war. And he said, well, we have to, it's like currency in Ukraine. We have to remain strong. And this is a heartwarming story. Yeah, I love it. I mean, from Kharkiv to Swindon, I mean, I don't know what the similarities are. I mean, what a culture shock that would be. But yeah, I mean, good luck to him. I think it's a great story.
And hopefully, have some affection, perhaps, for his adopted country. And if he wants to return home when it's safer, then obviously in a position to do that, rather than being traumatized and destroyed by war, as so many people who are in Ukraine today will be. Dee says, that's awesome. It's good news. I wish we heard more stories like this. We find one for you every time, Dee, as you know. So there's always something. There's always a bit of light somewhere amid the darkness. It's just a case of trying to hunt it out sometimes. Some days it's a bit harder to find than others. But thank you, everyone, for taking part. Thank you, Chris, for explaining all that to us. And pity about being scooped by the sun, but, that's the kind of thing they do. Thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you all again on Wednesday for another edition of the News Agenda. Till then, tatty bye.
Bye all.